Have you noticed that while the technology around us is quicker and more efficient than ever, we're still just as busy? The introduction of new technologies in our society is often framed as something to make all of our lives easier. Companies promise us more convenience and more efficiency, and we're sold the idea that the new tools should be taking away some of our labor and work and give us more free time. Time to spend with friends, family, or doing the things that we love. And with the introduction of AI a few years ago, people were excited to finally have some of their time back, to focus on creativity, on spending time with each other. And people started getting hopeful about the new societal-wide acceptance of the 4-day work week. Because with AI coming in and taking all of the grunt work, surely we'd only be needed there for the really important stuff. But with such leaps and bounds in the technological industries, why does life not feel easier? Hello everybody, welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Lola, and I make videos breaking down the systems and patterns that shape our everyday lives. If you like this essay and want to see more of my videos, make sure to subscribe below and click the bell button to be notified every time I post. And also, sorry in advance, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so my voice is still a bit croaky. But anyways, let's get back to the video. Because these ideas that we were all promised of an easier, more convenient life, this isn't the first time. Historically, every introduction of new technology has had a similar effect. We're talking the invention of microwaves, fridges, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and more recently, computers and the internet. And this time was no different. While some people in society were absolutely terrified of what the introduction of AI could mean for us and our future, many people were really excited to finally have some free time. But despite us having the most new age technology at our fingertips now, people are more exhausted than ever. We're constantly busy and overwhelmed and burnt out. But why? So before we get on to the rise of AI, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of modern work. Because early industrial capitalism had men working 10 to 14-hour days in physically strenuous jobs in factories, where the work they were doing was dangerous and exhausting, and not to mention completely poorly regulated. And at the same time, women were at home expected to perform full-time domestic labor, from cooking to cleaning to childcare to the laundry. Yet unlike the factory work, this work was unpaid and invisible, and all of the tasks at home are considered repetitive work where they need to be done and they need to be done again. With the introduction of the 40-hour work week by Henry Ford in 1926, there was a major improvement in working conditions. In fact, this 40-hour rule meant shorter hours, better regulation, and more time for leisure. But while this was a huge jump forward in work conditions, it was only benefiting the men in paid labor, because even with the reduction of the paid work week, there was no societal redistribution of domestic labor. There was no reduction in the amount of work that women were expected to do at home. There was no compensation introduced for them. And there was absolutely no expectation for the men to come and split the chores at home. Instead, what we got were an abundance of new technologies in the form of domestic appliances. And we were sold the idea that if you bought a washing machine for your house, or a vacuum, or a dishwasher, or a microwave, that the women at home would too get their reduction in labor. But that's not how it plays out in practice. Because as these technologies became common in every single household, there was a rise in expectations. Societally, women were then expected to complete more and more labor than ever, to wash clothes multiple times a week or per day, to keep their homes tidy at all times. Because what if you had a surprise visitor and they could see there was some mess in your house? What would they think of you? And they were expected to cook and prepare more elaborate meals than ever before. So while we were told that these new appliances would take some of the weight and the brunt off the women's shoulders, it never actually happened. In fact, that labor only intensified more and more and more. And as women across the world started to gain the right to work through the 20th century, that paid work only then added on top of the domestic labor. Because once again, there was no societal redistribution of the chores. So the result of these big technological and labor movements across the 20th century meant that men gained more leisure time, but women largely didn't. But if you look a bit more closely, this is a completely recurring pattern, because labour reform historically improves the conditions of paid visible labour, but completely ignores all the invisible, unpaid domestic labour. And this sets in a broader pattern where progress only ends up benefiting some groups rather than others. And labour never truly disappears for us. It shifts and expands and takes new forms, but it never truly goes away. So when we're once again told the narrative that new technology will free us from work and labour, who is this benefiting? So why do we keep getting stuck in this cycle where new technologies promise us freedom yet fail to deliver? Well, I think that part of the problem is that we tend to talk about work in this extremely broad way that encompasses a lot of different things. To break it down a bit more, I want to talk about a framework developed by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was a German-American philosopher and historian, and she wrote the book The Human Condition. In 2020, the journalist Lindsay Stonebridge wrote for The New Statesman that in her 1958 book The Human Condition, Arendt suggested we think again. It is not enough to imagine that we graft away, striving for some point at which we might be free of labour. In future automation or artificial intelligence, for example, or in the venal fantasies of super richness. For Arendt, it was in the active life, the vita activa, that we need to attend to, the lives we live together now and in the future. In her book, Arendt explicitly anticipates this continuation of modern automation and AI coming into our society. Yet she's immediately skeptical of the idea that freedom arrives later through technology. Stonebridge continues that Arendt's vita activa has three components: labour, work, and action. It is her distinction between labour and work that should concern us just now. Labouring is simply what we do to survive. We labour to eat, to keep our bodies healthy, to keep roofs over our heads, and to keep life reproducing. All animals labour, with or without coaxing, as do slaves and women who often literally labour behind closed doors. There's nothing special about labour, save for the fact that without it, we would die. So here she emphasises Arendt's points that labour is necessary, but completely endless. It sustains our lives, but it doesn't create meaning inherently. And Arendt also points out how historically feminized and invisibilized, taken for granted this labour is. Work, on the other hand, gives collective meaning to what we do. When we work to produce something, we both put something into and leave something lasting in this world. In short, what we work at makes up the human reality that we all share. Work is a part of what Arendt calls human artifice. It means that we are more than mere nature, and that we have made something that endures. We labour by necessity, but we work to create a human reality. So what you can see here is that work always has an endpoint. It has meaningful goals to create something durable, and it builds up a shared world for us all. On the other hand, losing work means losing your shared meaning. So as you can see in the definitions brought about by Arendt, the way that we divide work versus labour shows us what we give more meaning to. Even though labour is completely necessary, we often overlook it, but we revere the results from work and the people who do it. Arendt wrote her book in 1958, and already by then she was concerned about capitalist consumption. Arendt wrote the book The Human Condition in 1958, and even by then she was concerned that capitalist consumption would transform work into sheer labour. Stonebridge writes that if we all make only to consume, we leave nothing in the world, and we lose that shared sense of the world. As you can see here, this pattern of constant consumption turns our creativity into maintenance, endless cycles that leave nothing behind. But the collapse of the distinction between work and labour really matters, because without the meaning work gives us, there can be no shared ground for politics, for action, as Arendt calls her third and most important part of the vita activa. As this shared meaning in society disappears, politics collapses entirely, and everything becomes focused on survival and optimization. And when that happens, there's no space for collective action, which I think is what we're seeing now. Arendt uses a really interesting example in her book about a table. A table is a solid piece of craft work, but it's also something that people sit around together and yet still apart, being social but keeping a level of distance. Without that table, there's no forum for the politics of plurality that our societies should be aiming for. Because for politics to happen, there needs to be something we can all gather around that simultaneously marks out the differences between us. And that's what work gives us. It creates shared spaces yet allows us to keep our individuality within them. So while the labour created the table, the work gave it the meaning. So if we think about these definitions in the current context, AI is really good at taking over work. It's great at producing clear outputs and completing finite tasks, but what it doesn't do is eliminate labor. It doesn't take on the physical maintenance that we need to complete, and it also doesn't take on the emotional and cognitive load that we need to get through our lives. So this sort of explains the contradiction where things are more automated than ever, but we are still feeling just as tired, because it's replacing us in the areas of life that give us meaning, whereas we are still expected at a higher and higher level of expectation every time to complete all of the different areas of labor in our lives. It's not freeing us from those necessary tasks. Now, a big thing to highlight is the way that Arendt talks about labor is that it doesn't produce something lasting. And what I mean by that is labor is tasks that have to be done again and again. You can't clean your house one time and then it's just clean forever. You can't cook one incredible meal and then that's covered you for the rest of the year. And you can't just leave your baby in a cot and expect it to walk out of the door 18 years later. And while these are necessary tasks we have to complete every single day, a lot of them don't give us meaning. Arendt warns us that societies dominated by labor leave really little space for thinking or acting, because true freedom requires time outside this constant maintenance. But without intentional limits, labor just continues to expand. Because if you're handed all of the crap jobs at work and get them all done early, you don't get an early mark. You just get handed more crap. And like I mentioned in my earlier examples, efficiency alone doesn't actually lead to more freedom. Domestic labor didn't shrink because washing machines were introduced or microwaves. It continued to expand. Think about it. When microwaves were introduced, society was sold the idea that microwave meals would save up so much time in the woman's life, because without having to slave away over the stove for hours a day, she could have her own free time too. But now, you're seen as lazy if you have a microwave meal. We're told again and again how unhealthy that is, how our diet should consist of fresh organic produce every day, and the introduction of the vacuum cleaner didn't give any more breaks either. People's expectations just got higher and higher of how clean and tidy your house should be. So this brings us to now, with the introduction of AI. What's actually changing? And how is AI being implemented? Well, there are a few things AI is actually really good at. It's fantastic at pattern recognition, and that's actually how it was built, because it's not referencing a huge bank of data that it has. If you ask it for a quote from a specific author, it doesn't actually know that quote. For example, the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog." This is a common sentence in English that has every letter of the alphabet in it, and it's often used to teach kids the alphabet. So if you ask AI, what's that sentence that teaches you the alphabet that starts with the quick brown? It's learned from 50,000 different websites that have said that entire quote in full that the next word after brown is probably fox. So the entire model is pattern recognition. But it's also great with speed. It can write an essay for you in the space of a minute, complete an assignment for you in a couple of prompts, or become your personal therapist when you're having a bad day. It's also great with replication and scaling output. So with these skills, there's a number of tasks that AI replaces very easily. Writing drafts, generating images, sorting data, or producing content at big volumes. Writing drafts, generating images, sorting data, or producing content at high volumes. And when it comes to the modern workplace, it means that fewer people are needed to produce the exact same output. There are faster turnaround times than ever before, and the benchmark for productivity is raising little bit by little bit. But they can't replace everything. Humans are still needed for oversight and correction, to make decisions and take responsibility of the consequences. And there are new tasks for humans as well now. We have to learn how to most effectively write prompts for the AI. We have to edit and fact check its output and replace all those fake citations that it included in. So the work is changing forms in what it looks like in this day and age, but the labor still remains. In fact, once again, you can see that the biggest change in the modern workplace is the shift in expectations. There's no relief or extra time off. If something can be done faster, then it has to be. If output can be increased, then it is expected. So if AI ends up cutting some of your tasks down, that time saved isn't then treated as rest. Employers just see it as more available capacity to fill and absorb into new tasks. And while we already talked about the fact that labor remains, there's new forms of labor also being created by the introduction of AI. Because more than ever, we as workers are expected expected to be constantly available. We're expected to keep optimizing the work that we're completing. And we have a new wave of cognitive pressure to keep up, as well as constant anxiety about our jobs being taken over or us being replaced in the workplace. And with that, we feel a constant pressure to prove our usefulness. So as you can probably see, Hannah Arendt's framework really starts to make sense of our current patterns in everyday life, because AI is really good at taking over work and finishing tasks with a clear output. But while AI starts to automate some of the tasks like writing emails, generating images, translating texts, you'll notice that there's a lot of tasks that don't disappear when those tasks are automated, because your inbox is still going to fill up every single day. You're still going to get urgent notifications of work that needs responding to automatically, and there's still going to be really tight deadlines. In fact, those deadlines are probably going to be even shorter, and you're going to be expected to do so much more for each one. And yes, you can use AI as a tool to help you there, but you still have to check whether the output it came up with is correct or not. And at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility if anything is wrong. But how are you meant to be as comprehensive with your checks if you're meant to be churning out more and more work than ever? If a work email can now be written in 30 seconds as opposed to 10 minutes, you're not then getting 9.5 minutes of extra time. You're just meant to write 20 emails in 10 minutes rather than one. And some of these parts of modern work culture have become memes in today's age, like being seen as unreliable if you're not responding to messages immediately, or answering emails outside of work hours, or the wonderful quote, "Can you just quickly jump on a call?" And none of these work conditions are part of any of our job descriptions, but we're still expected to do them, even though they're increasing our cognitive and emotional labor. So as we start to see people coming to social media to talk about losing their jobs to AI, we can all see it as clear as day that these companies are cutting labor costs. But fewer roles in a company doesn't actually mean less labor overall. There's just a lot more pressure on the people who remain, and then increased labor for the people who lost their jobs in having to find new positions. I think this is a great point to move into the debate around 4-day work weeks, because in the last 10 to 15 years there has been a huge amount of research that supports the move to 4-day weeks. There's an abundance of evidence proving that the 4-day week improves well-being, reduces burnout, has equal or higher rates of productivity coming out of it, and allows people to have a better and more healthy work-life balance. And on paper, this sounds like a clear win for all of us. We spend less time at work, but we're still able to produce the same level of output, and we're healthier in general. But unfortunately, as always, there's a huge gap between scientific evidence and the widespread adoption of this new movement, because societies don't just change as soon as data exists, especially when that change has a potential to threaten the existing power structures. And if we look at this issue through Arendt's framework, it instead suggests that we're not going to see a healthier display of work in our lives. We're instead likely to see fewer positions overall, an exponential increase in layoffs justified by efficiency, and higher expectations on the remaining staff to deliver the same or more output. Even in the workplaces that have trialed various methods of shorter weeks, we often see labor spilling onto the free day or the free hours. Like some companies are trialing 10-hour 4-day weeks, which is still 40 hours. And for others, there are companies that are still expecting customer service hours Monday to Friday, meaning that people who are having a day off are probably still receiving emails and messages about work to do. And as that labor starts to creep into our rest time, that rest becomes more fragile and unprotected. So unless there's clear boundaries in place, a 4-day work week can quickly become 4 ridiculously intense, longer days, and then a bunch of unpaid mental and emotional labor on the 5th as well as the weekend. Now, of course, this doesn't mean 4-day weeks are pointless at all, and actually I am all for them, but it does mean that they require active protection and clear boundaries. People need to be allowed to have clear limits on their availability. We need clear cultural and societal shifts around responsiveness, and these protections need to come in the form of a collective agreement, not individual negotiations. But the other main victims in this scenario are the people who lose their jobs. Because if you look at Arendt's framework, job loss doesn't eliminate the labor at all. It actually ends up pushing them into a much more precarious relationship relationship with labor. Because remember, Arendt doesn't define labor as having a job. Labor is the ongoing effort required to stay alive. And as it becomes more desperate, that pressure to perform labor only intensifies. Because people who don't have jobs anymore still have to eat, pay rent, look after their families, maintain their health. And they have to remain employable, keep working on their skills, and not let go. But because that labor in their life is no longer mediated by their stable employment, it becomes fragmented through many different parts of their lives. In this day and age, that may look like constant job searching, continuing to retrain and upskill themselves. But what that also means is to fill in the gaps and keep paying their bills, they might have to take on a bunch of side hustles or gig work. And all of these things are still labor. They're all repetitive tasks that are necessary and exhaustive. But the key difference is that they're all or underpaid. So for people in stable jobs still, their survival is partly structured through the institutions. They're receiving wages, they're bound by contracts, there's unions protecting them. But for those who lose their jobs or are no longer in stable employment, that structural protection becomes individual. The responsibility of survival shifts onto themselves. And Arendt talks about this phenomenon as the privatization of labor, where each person must take on their own risk and manage their own survival continuously. More than that, when people lose their jobs, they lose what Hannah Arendt talks about as work, as in the ability to contribute to or produce something lasting in this world, and that feeling of being able to contribute to a shared world, because suddenly that person starts to rely on short-term disposable output, which can leave them feeling more alienated and lonely, and feeling a loss of shared purpose. Arendt sees this as really politically dangerous, and we can see it from my previous video with the misogynist red pill pipeline, because the people at the highest risk of being radicalized are those feeling alienated and lost, those who feel isolated and alone, and those who are no longer being protected by a collective system. So as we all start to feel the effects of AI in the modern world, and as more and more people's lives start to circle around necessity, people eventually have less time and energy for political participation, for thoughtful engagement in activism and shared community life. So while society becomes more efficient and productive, we become less capable of collective decision making. And think about it, if we're all exhausted all the time and we're constantly in survival mode, we're not able to think about things that are going on in the bigger sphere. Politics devolves into crisis responses constantly and culture wars. Meanwhile, we're all just trying to get through the day. So can there be real change, or are we doomed to continue on this cycle? Well, the thing is, no matter how companies or systems sell new technology to us, it doesn't automatically create freedom, and it never will. Because our freedom has to be chosen, actively chosen and defended by us. Because as these new technologies continue to increase convenience and efficiency, we have to keep actively fighting against these new norms. We have to change this societal understanding of availability, of us being free at every second of every day to complete tasks for work. We need to redefine what productivity means to us as a society. Because is it really churning out mediocre garbage at every second of the day? More than that, we need to individually value rest more and fight against this need to be productive at all moments, to take time truly away from work and from labor. And that may look different for everyone. Maybe that's switching off your phone when you're out with friends, or making a point-blank statement to never do work on the weekends. And of course, only so much change can be done on an individual level, because as always, the answer is somewhat structural change. Increased regulations about how AI should be and can be used in the workplace, more protections over people's stable employment, how many hours they're allowed to work, and the active protection and encouragement of unions. Lastly, we've got to reclaim our free time and encourage ourselves and others to take time for creativity, for political engagement, for working with the community, and for completing meaningful work. I truly think that there are cultural shifts starting to happen. More people are questioning these systems that are being thrown on us, and I'm seeing a lot of these conversations become more and more mainstream. And I think that's important, that we keep having these conversations about what labor and work mean to us, because naming this pattern that has continued to go around and round in circles is the first step to changing it. But tell me, what do you think? Were you able to predict this cycle before it happened? And do you think there's hope of us being able to break this pattern? Let me know below. I would love to start a discussion about this. And this is not by any means an all-encompassing video. There is so much more to this topic. This is barely scratching the surface. So I really do encourage you to get out there and do some more research. Because while technological innovation alone isn't going to lead us to freedom, progress with intent still can. But anyways, that's all from me today. So thank you very much for watching until this point. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and comment below. And if you want to see more of my piece essays or breakdowns, be sure to go check out my channel now. And as always, please remember to subscribe below because that really helps support me in doing these videos. So thanks again, and I will see you all next week for a new video. Bye!